Member for Chifley.
Deputy Speaker. My questions are to the Assistant Treasurer, and they relate primarily to the Assistant Treasurer, but always take the opportunity to talk with and ask questions of the Minister for Small Business. But at this point, I wouldn't mind pursuing a matter that the Assistant Treasurer knows I have an interest in, which relates to the transferal of functions of the private health insurance administration, the Administration Commission, or Council, shall I say, to APRA. APRA's job, as people are well aware, is fairly significant in terms of covering the banking and financial system through to superannuation and general insurance. They will be tasked with the responsibility from 1 July of being responsible for taking over FIAC's core responsibilities. FIAC at the moment is basically oversighting the responsibility or oversighting the job of 34 different private health insurers providing over 40,000 products and 6.4 million policies covering 13 million Australians. On top of APRA's fairly significant workload, they will now be required to give effect to the oversight of private health insurance regulation in this country, and it is a fairly big task. APRA already has a big amount of work on its plate, having to oversight or be cognisant of what's being proposed in terms of the Murray inquiry, in terms of what is coming from overseas, in terms of financial regulation and impact on the banks here, particularly through potentially increased capital requirements on the banks. APRA is also responsible, potentially through the Council of Financial Regulators, to introduce a variety of macroprudential tools within the within the lending market, particularly for housing, both owner-occupied and investor lending. And given that's of deep interest to me in Sydney, given the pace of growth in that market, the way in which APRA manages that is of deep concern. So having a set of functions responsible for the health insurance of 13 million people is something that's pretty serious. And what I am interested in finding out from the Assistant Treasurer is how many people in FIAC are currently responsible or being brought on within that regulator to manage these functions, and how many will be expected to be responsible in this space post the merger. How many people within APRA will be dedicated to this process of regulation and this new process for APRA, and what amount of money has been set aside for it. I understand industry consultation has been undertaken to help in the transition. Can the Assistant Treasurer detail how many meetings have been held and whereabouts in the country these have occurred, or have they just been concentrated on two capital cities? What concerns have been raised by industry and how these have been addressed? APRA says that it's met with various participants, and I'd be interested to know who those participants are other than the actual companies themselves. There's also apparently indication that formal meetings have been held with boards. Have all boards been met with? And if not, why not? Is the Assistant Treasurer confident that APRA will be able to provide robust regulatory oversight into the future, or is this simply a cover for a funding cut that will weaken the quality of oversight? And can he also explain the regulatory arrangements? To the Minister for Small Business, who I've had, I must say, fruitful discussions in relation to the potential introduction of a framework for equity crowdfunding in this country. We are, as the Minister knows, very keen to see this framework brought in as quickly as possible. I know he has a very similar degree of interest in seeing the framework introduced to support innovation in this country. I note that 7.8 million, from memory, has been dedicated to the development of a disclosure template that would be provided to ASIC. I'm interested in the development of that framework and when will it commence, given that the draft legislation isn't in place. I don't necessarily see that one has to follow the other, but it would be interesting to know where that process is at. Have consultations begun between ASIC and stakeholders? Which stakeholders have been targeted? And is there a formal consultation process being observed, and how's that being implemented?
I thank the member for Chifley and I call the Minister.
Well, thank you, Ms Acting Deputy Speaker. The member for Deputy Speaker, the member for Chifley asked an important question, and I know he has asked similar questions in the House. As you know, we had a Commission of Audit, which was led by Tony Shepherd and a distinguished group of former public servants and a former minister in Amanda Vanstone. And it recommended a series of measures to consolidate the functions of government in order to derive important efficiencies and ultimately better consumer outcomes. And as a result, this government has undertaken a number of reforms to reduce substantially the number of statutory bodies and agencies and committees, where we have been able to consolidate the back office functions of various agencies. We've done that. Where we've been able to integrate various functions within existing departments, we have done that. And this has led to hundreds of millions of dollars of savings to the taxpayer. And one of the sensible reforms in this vein that we have continued with is moving FIAC into APRA. And it just makes sense because FIAC is responsible for, as the member for Chifley said, health insurance regulation, but APRA is responsible for life insurance and general insurance regulation. And so therefore there are a lot of similarities that can be derived by bringing those two bodies together. And we have engaged in extensive consultation, not just with the stakeholders, but also more broadly. And we have, as a result, I think, got a very important set of reforms which could over time lead to lower costs to the industry, which hopefully will be passed on in the form of lower premiums. Now, I was asked, what about the number of people within APRA to do this function? And we're very, very satisfied that APRA does have the right amount of people, and as I've been advised, up to 80% of the people working in FIAC will be moving across to APRA in the first instance, and this will ensure a level of continuity. But I think the member for Chifley can be reassured that the Minister for Health still retains the ultimate responsibility when it comes to the premium, accountability, but the regulatory functions and prudential functions can be very effectively carried out by APRA in this case.